started by Rupert Murdoch wasn't that old. In 1981, when the royal engagement was announced, the Sun newspaper, I think, had only been in publication for about 20 odd years. And this whole phenomenon of tabloid newspapers, tabloid radio, tabloid television hadn't really been around for longer than, I think, 20, 25 years in Britain. And so Diana, unfortunately for her, became the target for these rather sort of oixome hooligan type photographers. That kind of journalism, I mean, you can't even really call that any, you can't, that's not journalism at all. In actual fact, these men who work for the tabloid press, who hounded Diana, you couldn't even describe these people as serious photographers. What I consider a photographer is somebody like Yves Bertrand, the French photographer who does these amazing aerial photographs of different places on planet Earth. These people are more or less like hunters, except without guns. They have cameras. Though I have to say that some of the cameras with the giant long lenses do look like shotguns. And Diana was a teenager when she came into the situation, and there was several instances where the press had actually driven her to tears. While the early years of the Charles and Di marriage are going on, it's very, very interesting because Prince Philip made, quite a few politically incorrect remarks, which I'm sure many of us know about. Allegedly, he described Chinese people as slitty-eyed bastards during a state visit. I believe it was to the Great Wall of China. Allegedly, he also really complained about the quality of gravy to some state banquet and described it as washing up water. Allegedly, he was also asked what would he like to come back on Earth as if he was reincarnated, and he said, "I'd like to be reincarnated." This is allegedly what he said, as a bacteria that would wipe out a large proportion of the Earth's population. Prince Philip is not Greek. That is a complete fallacy. His family are actually German. And his sisters are completely and utterly out of the royal limelight right from the first day that he comes into the public eye in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And his sisters married senior Nazis. Now, Prince Philip was the subject of a documentary which was broadcast 4 years ago on Channel 4 television in Great Britain. And he was a playboy, a classic royal playboy. And this documentary portrayed him as going to, sort of the jet set sort of parties of that era. And he was friendly with Stephen Ward. Now, Stephen Ward was a gentleman in, the sort of swinging 60s who used to procure rather attractive young ladies for escorting members of the aristocracy to parties, cocktail evenings, dances, and this kind of thing. One of the young ladies that Stephen Ward procured for one of his friends was a lady called Christine Keeler. And Christine Keeler had an affair with the Labour Minister of War at the same time as also bed-hopping with a senior Russian military officer. And this is right in the middle of the Cold War. And John Profumo, the minister who'd had this, affair with Christine Keeler, resigned and came under intense media scrutiny. And Prince Philip knew Stephen Ward. And Stephen Ward was the man who was responsible for procuring the services of Christine Keeler for John Profumo. And in actual fact, at the time when all of this came out, and obviously being a pimp and prostitution was illegal, the time that this all came into the public eye, there was an exhibition in London of sketches which had been done by Stephen Ward, who was an artist. They were sketches which had been done at Buckingham Palace of members of the royal family, which proves that Stephen Ward, this society pimp, if you like, was very well connected with the royal family and with other people working at Buckingham Palace. And there is a sketch by Stephen Ward. I mean, Stephen Ward was an excellent artist, and it is of Prince Philip. And they were friends, and that is absolutely for sure. So, with the newspapers going to town and being extremely interested in the extramarital activities of John Profumo and trying to piece together the actual story of all of these high society parties with these working class call girls being brought in by Stephen Ward, the royal family obviously panicked. They didn't want anything to do at all with Stephen Ward, who'd been arrested and was in the dock for racketeering, pimping prostitutes. So they sent Anthony Blunt, who is the Queen's nephew and the curator of the Queen's private art collection, down to the gallery that was exhibiting the sketches by Stephen Ward, and gave Anthony Blunt all of the money to buy those sketches. Now, what's really an eye-opener is that Anthony Blunt was a KGB agent, and he was later outed as such, and he was loyal to Lenin and Leninists, and he was a Trotskyite, and he was actually a mole inside Buckingham Palace, feeding information about the royal family back to the communists in Russia. What transpired is that rather conveniently, Stephen Ward committed suicide. Now, what's transpired in recent years is that we've now found out that Stephen Ward was not only friends with the royal family, he was an occultist and he was interested in black magic. And for part of his life he was living in a small cottage on a private estate called the Cliveden Estate, which is owned by the Astor family, who are a very, very well-to-do, well-established branch of the British aristocracy. And after Stephen Ward's death, I mean, I won't call it suicide because I think that Stephen Ward was killed in order to stop the Profumo affair from getting any more dangerous for the royal family. After Stephen Ward's death, the Astor family actually paid a Catholic priest to visit the cottage where Stephen Ward had lived. And the reason they did that is because there was ghost activity there. Apparently there'd been lots of seances and rituals done there as part of these high society gatherings. And as anybody who has experimented with the Ouija board knows, if you don't do the whole thing properly and put the spirits to sleep, they hang around. And the cottage that Stephen Ward had occupied on the Cliveden estate had become haunted. And the Catholic priest made a comment, which is on record, and he said that the dark forces, the spiritual black forces that he encountered during the exorcism were the darkest, most powerful forces that he had ever experienced in all of his years working as an exorcist.
Our investigation into the death of Princess Diana starts here, at Eltham Palace, known as the Secret Palace, just a few miles from central London. This is where the young Henry VIII grew up, and several centuries later, when the palace was occupied by the wealthy Courtaulds family, Eltham Palace became the headquarters of an organisation which evolved into what we now call MI6, Overseas British Military Intelligence. This is the oldest bridge in London. It was here on the banks of the moat that Henry VIII composed his famous song, Greensleeves. Henry VIII is also remembered for having 6 wives, but what he is least remembered for is being a murderer. Henry VIII ordered the execution of his wife, Anne Boleyn, simply because she had not bared him a son. Anne was imprisoned and beheaded before a court of nobility at the Tower of London. Henry also ordered the execution of several men who he falsely claimed had committed adultery with Anne. Anne's daughter succeeded the throne as Elizabeth I. In September 1560, 2 years into her reign, the 27-year-old Queen Elizabeth I was implicated in a suspected murder of Lady Robert Dudley, the wife of Lord Robert Dudley, who was Queen Elizabeth's secret lover. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Queen Elizabeth made Lord Dudley the Earl of Leicester, but they never married, for fear of the mass speculation and suspicions throughout Britain, causing them both to be accused of murder. On the 1st of February 1587, Queen Elizabeth I ordered the execution of her half-sister, Mary, Queen of Scots. However, Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I were not the first murdering monarchs to occupy the royal throne. They were descended from a long aristocratic tradition of crowned killers who would often savour a passion for black magic. 80 years prior to Queen Elizabeth I's reign, in 1483, King Richard III commissioned Sir James Tyrrell to kill his nephews, the young Prince Edward and Prince Richard. In the dead of night, Sir James Tyrrell and 2 assistants smothered the young princes, thus ensuring the bloodline of Richard III became the new monarchy of Britain. Prior to King Richard murdering the 2 young princes, In 1477, the Duke of Clarence said that his brother, King Edward, practiced the